The King of Time by Hamza Malik. There once lived a boy who loved playing with pebbles. He'd collect them in the morning, line them up proudly in the street, and play games with them until sunset. One day, the king of the land noticed him playing with his pebbles, and being a wise leader, asked his advisor to walk by the boy and drop a gold coin. The advisor did as he was asked, and the king watched intently from a distance as the boy played with his pebbles, and then noticed the glinting gold in the dust nearby. He picked it up and looked around expectantly, his shining green eyes scanning for people nearby. He spotted the advisor walking away and ran towards him, jumping up to tap him on the shoulder, and gave him the coin back. The king was impressed and asked his servants to inquire about the boy. They discovered he was an orphan, living in terrible squalor. So the king asked if he'd like to live in the palace. The boy eagerly accepted, thinking of all the room he'd have there to play with his pebbles. He hurried back and grabbed his lucky pebble, which was oval-shaped with a crooked line dancing down the middle of it. The king noticed this and smiled, asking the boy what was special about the pebble, and the boy excitedly told the king all about the games he would play in the streets, and how he always won when playing with his lucky pebble. The king listened patiently and nodded, saying he too played pebble games as a boy, but his hands were far too old and frail now to be useful. With a beaming smile, the boy held up his lucky pebble and said they could share it because it would never let its owner down. The king smiled warmly and tousled his hair, quietly promising himself to always protect the boy and his fearless innocence. And so the years passed, and the boy became a man. He became like a son to the king, who entrusted him with his kingdom's most delicate affairs. One day, the king fell sick, and the boy traveled far and wide, frantically searching for a cure. Alas, he was unsuccessful, and one cold winter's night, the king died in his sleep. The boy was beside himself with grief, so much so that he ran away from the palace, unable to look at anything that reminded him of the king. Months passed, and the boy started to have dark thoughts about ending his pain. He was walking in a daze towards a cliff edge when he noticed an egg on the ground. He carefully picked it up and placed it in a tree nearby. As he turned to leave, he heard a thunderous explosion, and a brilliant flash came from the tree. A huge bird made of pure light unfurled its wings, and the boy fell to his knees, holding his arm to his face. The light from the bird poured endlessly into the sky, and speaking in a rumbly voice, it introduced itself as the Tempest and thanked the boy for his selfless act. It then offered him one wish in return. The boy, still in anguish over the death of his father figure, said he just wanted things to stop, that life was too painful to bear. The Tempest screeched and wriggled a silver ring off its smallest talon, which fell to the ground and shrank as it did so. The boy picked it up gingerly, turning it around in his hands. The Tempest told him this ring, when worn and twisted twice clockwise, would trigger a curse that stopped time. Twisting it again would lift the curse. Without hesitation, the boy pushed the ring over his index finger and twisted. Just before he did though, the Tempest screeched once more, and said that while time was stopped, only the animals, sea, sun, moon, and stars would function normally. He would also never need to eat or drink while time was stopped. The boy nodded eagerly and thanked the Tempest. The majestic bird urged him to be careful and then vanished. With a shuddering breath, the boy twisted twice, and there was an almighty bang. He ran back to a nearby village and, to his amazement, realized everyone was frozen. Men stood frozen mid-step, children were suspended in mid-air while jumping off trees, and a woman stood motionless at a nearby stream collecting water, although the water itself was overflowing out of her bucket. The boy twisted the ring twice again, and everything returned to normal. The child landed on the floor with a giggle, and the woman shook her head and tutted to herself as she scolded herself for daydreaming. For the next few weeks, The boy turned time on and off several times just to ensure everything worked as the tempest claimed. Then one day, he twisted the ring twice and walked off into the sunset, exhausted by his grief, tears streaming down his face. He walked for several years across every land imaginable, not worrying about anyone else or any dangers. He slept under the stars and spent time by the sea, watching the birds. After a few years had passed, he realized he quite liked having time under his thumb and toyed with the idea of not ever turning it back again. He wasn't aging, and no one who was frozen would have lost any time of their own, so it seemed like a fair deal. He became enamored with the idea of total immortality, sometimes screaming from the mountaintops how he was the true king of time. The boy woke up one day on a beach, time still frozen in a beautiful mosaic. His trousers were wet from the tide, but he knew the ocean's ebbing and flow well enough by now to know it wasn't dangerous at this time of the month. He yawned and then suddenly gasped. His ring was missing. He scrambled around for it everywhere but could not find it. He retraced his steps, dug in the sand for hours, but was unsuccessful. He then sat down and the truth dawned on him. Before falling asleep the previous night, he had been playing with the ring, turning it around in his hands. He had then placed it in his palm before drifting off to sleep. His hands shot down to his trousers, which were soaking wet. His eyes widened, and he screamed as he turned towards the endless ocean. The tide had come in and snatched the ring from his hand. Even with all the time in the world, he would never find the ring again, not if it was at the bottom of the ocean or carried to new shores somewhere in the world. And so the boy traveled for 100 years, searching desperately for his ring, calling out to the tempest now and again to see if it would help, but to no avail. One day, as the boy sat on a cliff edge looking at a particularly beautiful sunset, a crow came and perched near him. It eyed him for a moment before speaking, startling the boy. The crow introduced himself as the Crendel and said that he had watched the boy for a long time but had grown tired of his endless searching for the ring. The boy's heart skipped a beat. The Crendel paused and said he knew where the ring was, but first, he wanted something from the boy. The Crendel told the boy to travel to the biggest kingdom in all the land and break into the king's inner sanctum, the place reserved only for the most valuable treasures, and steal his most prized ruby, which was rumored to be the size of a firstborn son's ego. The Crendel said it was rumored that this room was bursting with treasure, so to help himself as well if anything took his fancy. The boy laughed in both relief and exasperation, for he had grown up in this very kingdom, and he was the only man apart from the king who knew where the inner sanctum was. He had never visited it while in the king's care, but had been told about it by the king himself before he died. The boy traveled back to the palace where he had grown up, walking silently through the halls until he arrived at the secret door which led to the inner sanctum. He ignored everyone frozen in time, as he knew he'd stop to reminisce, and the Crendel seemed like an impatient creature. Walking past the frozen guards and straight into the inner sanctum, the boy frowned. The room was as big as a citadel, but completely empty. There was no treasure, gold coins, rubies, or mountains of diamonds to speak of. The only thing in the middle of the room was a small wooden box. He opened it and stood frozen for another year. There was no ruby, sapphires, or pearls in the box. It was an oval-shaped pebble, with a crooked line dancing down the middle. The boy sobbed and realized he had been running away from his own grief, smothering his own pain for so long that the young boy who loved playing pebbles in the streets so long ago was barely recognizable anymore. As the boy returned to the Crendel, he explained that there was no ruby, and showed him the pebble. The Crendel squawked in annoyance and said he could keep his strange pebble, and that he'd help him anyway. The boy listened intently as the Crendel told him that on that fateful night, it was he who had stolen the ring, not the ocean. The Crendel had wriggled it out of his hand with his little beak, vowing to put it somewhere so safe, no one would find it. At this news, the boy nearly flew into a fit of rage, but he held his composure and kindly asked the Crendel where he had placed the magic ring. The Crendel squinted at him and said it would be the only place the man looking for it wouldn't search. He flapped his wings and flew off, circling around the boy 3 times and telling him that he snored when he slept, so he placed the ring into his face nest for safekeeping. The Crendel had dropped the ring into the boy's mouth. It had been in his stomach all along. He cast his mind back to the Tempest, hundreds of years ago, and recalled that it said he would never eat or drink, meaning he could not force himself to vomit or relieve himself. The ring was well and truly stuck, and time was frozen until something was done about it. It was then that the boy knew what he had to do, and felt a strange sense of relief. He walked to the edge of the cliff and fell to his knees, unsheathing a dagger from his boot that he hadn't touched in the longest time. He kept his gaze fixed on the sunset and plunged the dagger into his stomach, gasping at the wave of pain engulfing him. As he bled onto the cliff, he saw his pebble in front of him, drops of blood landing on it. The boy realized that time was only beautiful because it passes and runs its course. The very moment he was living, with blood pouring from his open wound with the seconds dwindling away, was more precious than the last 300 years he had spent endlessly roaming the world. The boy slowly reached into his wound and fumbled around until he found the ring. He placed it on his finger and with a shuddering breath twisted it once. He looked down at his pebble and wept openly for the first time in an age. He wept for his dear king. He wept for his childhood spent in squalor, and he wept for the mountain of tender memories he had so easily forgotten in search of selfish solace. He remembered the king tussling his hair, playing pebbles with him in the courtyard, running home to the palace after lazy afternoons studying under apple trees, and how his life had only been beautiful because of the people in it. Without them, it had been like trying to paint a sunset with a palette full of soot. With one final shuddering breath, the boy twisted the ring for the last time and collapsed as he heard an almighty bang, realizing the end of all things carried with it a quiet beauty that even infinity would never match. Violet's Second Chance by Gillian Corsiato. Grade 5 had ended on a sour note for young Violet. On one of the very last days of elementary school, she had been caught stealing an eraser from a grade 5 only book fair set up in the hallways. She was humiliated in front of her teacher and her entire class when a parent volunteer walked in with the school principal and pointed her out specifically as the thief. She was then forced to publicly return the eraser that she had taken, and the shame she felt was all-consuming. Summer vacation couldn't come fast enough after that. Maybe after 2 whole months of no school, her classmates from grade 5 would forget all about the ordeal and she could sneak subtly into middle school without catching anyone's attention. It was much safer to fit in quietly than to stand out. The summer break had been rejuvenating, relaxing, and refreshing. The eldest of 6 kids in the family with a single mom, Violet spent a lot of her time around home babysitting her siblings. However, she was old enough now that she could take them on short adventures to the playground or for walks around the block. If money allowed, she could even walk them down to a nearby convenience store where they could pick out an ice cream treat or a cool drink. Though she was often in charge of looking after the kids while mom was busy or working, she still found enough free time to contently sit down and read a book. Reading was one of her absolute favorite things to do. She could read the same book 5 times over again before she got tired of it. It didn't matter what she was reading, all that mattered was that she was reading at all. Now, on the night before a new school year would start, Violet sat cross-legged in the soft grass of the backyard. Around her, the bugs of the evening started to sing and the sunset painted the sky a deliciously golden color. The clouds were like smears of white paint. As an 11-year-old going ready to step into her first day of middle school, she figured it was time for some introspective reflection. Being the oldest of her 5 younger siblings, Violet was used to the prospect of having to grow up and mature quickly, so wasn't necessarily uncomfortable with how she was feeling on this eve of the first day back at school. A mosquito buzzed irritatingly around her ear. When it landed on her cheek, she swatted at it and it left a dismal display of blood and bug guts on her skin. "Yuck," she said, using her shirt sleeve to wipe it off. The back door opened. Mom stepped outside onto the deck and closed the door behind her. Violet looked up at her from where she was sitting on the grass. "How are you feeling?" asked Mom. Violet picked a dandelion up from out of the ground and gently blew on it, sending fluffy wisps of seeds wherever the air decided to take them. One wispy seed clump landed on her cheek just opposite to where the mosquito had landed. Looking up at her mom, she smiled. "I'm feeling good," she replied. "Ready for tomorrow. First day of middle school. I'm ready." Mom walked down the deck stairs and joined her eldest daughter in sitting on the ground. She then put her arm around her and pulled her in for a one-arm hug. "You know I'm always proud of you, right?" asked Mom. The truth is, Violet didn't always know this. She spent so much time being the second mom figure to all her younger siblings that sometimes she couldn't tell at all if her mom was proud and thankful for her or if Mom simply saw Violet as an equal. Another mom, another adult in the house ran wild with little kids. As an answer to Mom's question, Violet shrugged, but the corners of her lips curled upwards. Together they sat silently in the grass for some time, just taking in the heavenly summer evening before Violet broke the silence. "I wonder if I'll make some new friends this year," she said. "Of course you will," Mom replied in a way that was uncharacteristically enthusiastic for her. "All your old classmates will be there, but a bunch of kids from other schools will be there too." At the mention of the word kids, Violet felt her neck and shoulders relax. She had been unaware up until that point that she was unintentionally holding stress in her upper body. It felt good to relax, and she realized her body hadn't felt relaxed like that all summer, despite the summer vacation feeling serene and fairly stress-free. Mom then spoke again. "Maybe you'll find a new friend who loves reading just as much as you do." Mom rarely took an interest in Violet's reading. She was too busy feeding babies, wrangling toddlers, and putting the older kids in timeout to stop and ask about a book she may have been reading. "You know, when I was a kid, I loved reading too." "Really?" asked Violet, feeling suddenly inquisitive. "Yep, back then, it felt like I had all the time in the world for reading." Violet wanted to know more. "What did you like to read?" she pressed on. "Anything and everything," Mom replied. "Encyclopedias, poetry, magazine articles, mysteries, romances, dramas, anything." "Do you still have any of your old books?" Violet inquired further. No," Mom said with a hint of sadness in her tone. "Most of the books I read were from the library. The few books that I did own to myself were sold in a garage sale to raise money for me to go to college." Violet didn't know her mom had ever gone to college. Almost as if reading her daughter's mind, Mom continued to explain. "I didn't make it all the way through college, but I did get a decent start at it." "Why not?" Violet asked. She was as captivated by her mom's story as she was by any of the most interesting books she had ever read. "Because I had you." Violet felt suddenly guilty, but Mom pulled her in again for a tight hug, indicating there was no soreness to be felt about the disruption of college caused by the birth of a baby. Violet felt comforted by her mom and got the sense that there were no hard feelings arising from the conversation, which had gotten promptly more serious in nature. "I hope I get to go to college, too," said Violet. "I hope that for you, too, dear," said Mom. "But we probably won't be able to afford it," said Violet, now sounding dejected. "We've got time. We can save up." An idea struck Violet's mind like a bolt of lightning. "I could sell some of my books," she said. Just like you did. You sure could, said Mom. But you're only 11. I think you should keep them for a while yet. A dragonfly flew towards the pair and landed gently on Mom's foot. Violet reached out to it and the dainty insect crawled onto her hand. It stayed perched there while the mom and daughter examined and appreciated its intricate beauty, and then, just as fast as it came, it flew off into the calm summer evening and left the mom and daughter duo to taste the sweet air for a little while longer in their own retrospective silence. Groundhog Seeking Employment by Tanya Humphreys. Paige Harper, in her mysterious world, did not hear her brother as he snuck into her room, tiptoeing like Sylvester the cat after Tweety. The basement room had been used for storage until all three people concerned felt it best that Paige take it as her room. Her mother didn't have to put up with her. Her little brother got his own room in the attic, and she got blessed darkness and quiet. Benny was the opposite of his sister. He played sports and ran around with school chums, usually on their bicycles, all summer long. They had a penchant for all things noisy and loud: firecrackers, horns that went triple-A ooga, cap guns, and so on. Even Benny's little terrier Mix made up for his wee size with a stupendously loud bark. A month earlier, while school was still in session, Ricky had brought one of his father's Coast Guardsmen's air horns to school. At lunchtime, the group of 4 boys raced off into the woods as far from the schoolyard as possible to sound it off. Yoza! What a holler! Benny had coveted it ever since. After his 8th birthday, he had traded his new Spider-Man watch for that magnificent horn. Paige's room was not entirely silent. Floorboards creaked above her where the kitchen was, as her mother prepared dinner. She heard cupboards thud, the oven door squeal open, and Redrum's toenails clicking as the dog followed Phoebe around. A scrap or two would be his. Phoebe was messy. By the time she made dinner, she'd be 4 martinis into her cups. Sometimes, when all was quiet, her mother's 4-quart soup pot would crash to the floor, sending Paige's nerves through her skin like needles burning with acid, and the inevitable scream escaping her lips. She would shake uncontrollably for an hour afterwards, the sound echoing again and again in her head like a bass drum in a marching band of tormenting ghouls. The little tormenting ghoul upstairs would laugh hysterically, and the screeching and stomping of their mother inevitably pushed her deeper into the blue lighthouse in the spectrum of her mind. Just a half-mile past the rundown house at the edge of town, the Ocean View River lazily winds its way through the forest, through the meadow at the looming dusty purple foothills, and beyond. It was in this meadow, right at the edge under a vast hemlock bush, where Dusty lived. As the sun was setting, throwing long shadows over the dry yellow grass, a small figure plodded along a well-worn path to where it disappeared under a mass of blooming lavender. Dusty normally paused at the purple blooms to take in their heady aroma. He himself smelled of the fragrant flower, as he had a passion for rolling in it. Today, he merely glanced at it and sighed. "What's the matter, Dusty? You're not your cheerful self." It was his best buddy, Mike, a raccoon. "Oh, nothing," said Dusty. "Well, for you to not stop and smell the flowers, I know something is terribly wrong." Dusty turned to his friend and sighed heavily. Mike put an arm around the groundhog's shoulders and turned with him, so they were facing west. "Look at that sunset. It's magnificent tonight with the floaty clouds out there on the horizon." Dusty glanced up and nodded. "It is a smashing one indeed, my friend. But I think I'll just go into bed." "Don't be daft. You're going to share this wicked burrito with me and tell your old pal Mikey what's wrong." Dusty had to smile. His mom was from London. Both she and her son spoke with a lilting accent that Mike had found cool. The raccoon had picked up a slew of British terms from him. Dusty had no desire to pick up any of the American slang, and his human employers had encouraged him in sticking to his British roots. They said his voice was pleasing to American viewers. He sat next to Mike and sniffed at the proffered half burrito in the raccoon's hand. Egads, that thing's turned at least a week ago. Aged beef, man. Heavenly. Besides, the wrapper says Taco Bell, so it's full of yummy preservatives. Dusty raised his eyebrows in disbelief. You'll make yourself ill. Don't be daft. I've got an iron stomach, Mike said as he rubbed his ash-gray belly. You've been eating too much good food, gourmet stuff. Am I right? Dusty sighed. He would miss the gourmet meals. I'm just not hungry. You go on and enjoy your food. Mike shrugged and chomped and licked his lips. After half was gone, he said, I've seen that commercial, you know. Dusty looked over perplexed. Yeah, over at the Johnson's house. Got a good view of the TV from the window. Mike, that's dangerous. You said you wouldn't do that anymore. I know, you're right. And I promise to stop as soon as they're done binge watching Game of Thrones. They sat watching the sunset in silence, only broken by Mike's soft burps. On this early evening, Paige's basement room was deeply and calmingly dark, the only illumination a small desk lamp on her desk. She was inking in a sketch she'd penciled the day before and pleased with the results so far. Illustrating put her in a pleasant zone like nothing else could. Her mother's footsteps and Redrum's clickings faded into a familiar cadence. Her soft light brown hair fell over her shoulder and onto the page as she leaned forward to select a finer tipped ink brush. She flipped her hair from off the page. It cascaded onto her left side, revealing her right eye in the profile of her pale, delicately featured face. The shadow on the door behind her halted and froze. Slowly, with all the patience it could muster, the shadow raised its arm and slid from the rectangle of light against the door. WHA. The air horn was an apocalyptic weapon of mass destruction in the low-ceilinged room. Paige screamed. She whacked her throbbing head against the desk but didn't feel a thing as she fell. She curled up into a ball. The horn's screaming wail went on and on. As her throat rawed like bloody road rash, the screaming grew hoarser, and she realized with revulsion that it was she who'd been making the noise. At last, when she stopped screaming, she heard a dog barking, a wicked boy laughing, and a drunk woman screeching. The sounds were faint, as if she was going deaf. Point in God's name, Benny. Arf, 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 arf. And shut that mud up before I do for good. Point, aw mom, having a little fun. Arf, arf, arf. Gone and messed herself again. Point you, mom. Their voices undulated like pulses under the sea. I'm going deaf, good. Paige was in her lighthouse, her safe place, her alone place. She teleported herself there through a bluish-purplish portal that resembled a swirling intestinal tract. It was always night here, cool and dark. The white of the moon sometimes made her eyes tingle, not in an unpleasant way, but more like a hypnotist's waving silver watch inspires positive apprehension. On this night, the moon was just the sliver of a friendly eye winking at her. The stars were as bright as ever, cheerily twinkling, and cool as mentholated balm. The revolving light of the lighthouse was steady in its slow revolutions, flashing in slow motion over the black ocean, sending a rippling pale blue streak to the far horizon. When she'd hurtled into the circular stone room, her heart had been lodged high in her throat, choking her. She could gather no air into her burning lungs. When she opened her eyes and saw the familiar place, she relaxed at last and sat at the arched stone window. Paige turned to her right and pulled the worn oak table to her. She fingered through the pencils and brushes on the shelf above it, chose a hard lead for light sketching, and began to draw on the creamy white page before her. Dusty's mom had always told him he was different. He was abnormally bright, as if a human brain had been implanted in his furry head. His mom had been taken from London, England, and put in a California game farm. She burrowed under a fence and was free, eventually finding the beautiful meadow and digging the burrow he now lived in. She'd escaped because she was pregnant and wanted her babies to live free like their groundhog ancestors. The lavender reminded her of the heather from her home. One day when Dusty was just 4 months old, he'd been foraging in a garden behind a small wooden house not far from the meadow. A small girl had been in the garden picking peas. A low-flying airplane had roared overhead, perhaps dusting a nearby field. The girl had curled into a ball, covering her face and making herself small. Dusty hid. As he watched, a woman came into the garden. She bent to the child and enveloped her into her arms. A man came to them. He smelled bad, sour, with crazy oozing from his pores. He said to the woman, "Leave her alone. Let her curl up and lie there. You go on and make my supper. But Drake, she's just delicate, please." The woman's voice was cut by a sharp slap. The woman carried the small child inside, following the man. 3 days later, Dusty was again in the garden sampling the new sweet pea flowers. He came around the end of a fragrant row and the girl was there. She was using her finger to draw in the soil. A small tin pail of beans sat beside her. The girl's finger froze as she looked up and into Dusty's eyes. The girl's eyes were such a pale blue, they looked nearly gray. Her skin was the color of cream. She had a scattering of fine freckles across the bridge of her nose. She was radiant as she smiled. "Hello," she said softly. Her lips had not moved. Her mother stomped over, and Dusty ducked out of sight. The woman slapped the child across the back of her head and screeched, "What you doing, girl? Pick up that pail. What is wrong with you?" She picked the small, frail girl up and stomped back to the house. Dusty sat stunned for a minute. "My imagination." He shook off the strange feeling of confused awe, picked some beans for his mum, and went home. It was no wonder his dreams that night were awfully strange. He found himself along a rocky coast at night. He had never been to the ocean in his life, following a sandy path to a small wooden bridge with fat hemp rope sides. On the other side sat the tallest structure he'd ever seen. It was of rough stone and round and painted truly in blue. Its top was lost in dark, wispy clouds. They parted, and a bluish-white light burst forth like a giant eye. He was very frightened and figured he would now wake up. He did not. Instead, he heard a voice in his head, "Hello, friend. Welcome." It was the little girl's voice, and the fear was replaced by a calm, ethereal happiness and contentment he'd never felt before. He crossed the bridge and the realization that it was groundhog-sized made him smile. "Dusty." Not the girl's voice. "Go away. Wake up, sweetheart." It was his mother. "This is a big day for you, come on now. I'm making your favorite breakfast." He had felt an overwhelming loss inside, of what it couldn't say. He loved his mother dearly, but she was a bit daft, in a lovable way, and he knew she'd prepared a salad for him. That was what she always made for their meals. He realized he was feeling intensely melancholy and needed to snap out of it. Today he was going to work in the city. And now, a year later, he huddled in the burrow, a bleak black fog of depression seeping into his ears, nose, mouth. Every pore felt the destructive tendrils prying and invading. His mom had passed while he was at work in the city. "Hey man, snap out of it." Mike was back. Dusty groaned. "Leave me alone." "Come on mate, get up." Then he said in an ominous deep voice, "Winter is coming." That got the corners of Dusty's mouth curling upwards. Mike nudged Dusty and he sat up. Mike said, "But not for another 3 months. Dude, no hibernating for you yet." "Okay. Talk to me." "I got laid off." "I sort of figured it was something like that." "Yeah. I felt it coming. That last commercial killed my career." "But you're not a gimmick. You can talk to humans." "Phenomenal. I never should have revealed that in the first place. I'm a freak. They want to cut me up now to see how I do it. Barely escaped. Can't go back. I get that. But life here is great. Peaceful. So much beauty. Come on, let's watch the sunset. I got a BK Whopper in me pocket." His brilliant fake British accent matched his toothy grin. Okay, let's. The next night, Dusty wandered the streets of the city covertly, sticking to the shadows and alleys. He didn't know what he was going to do. He was depressed and listless. He knew this but couldn't shake the feeling of hopelessness. He walked and crept and crept. His ears detected minute sounds and he ducked accordingly, out of sight. He thought to himself, why do I bother? He was on the outskirts of the city when he heard a shrill scream. He'd heard it before. Curious, and with a newfound lust for life, he went towards the sound. Gradually, he detected more sounds of distress, sounds that hurt his heart. He had nothing to lose. He homed in on the sounds and eventually came upon a huge rectangular brick building that exuded an air of dismal despair and hopelessness. It was an ugly design. That architect should be shot, he thought, as he took in the enormity of its 4 stories. In the dark of night, he realized only by getting closer to it that it was painted blue and featured thick black iron bars on every single window. Being an animal that could talk and read human stuff, he went around to the front and read the sign announcing Lighthouse Instant Ion. There was a capital iron U hanging askew and a T missing entirely. Dusty, after living in the city and with humans, understood that this was a home for the insane. Some criminally perhaps, some trapped in vague state. His sharp ears heard screams and cries and moans. But he was drawn to the place regardless. I feel I belong here. Lol. He slunk around the base of the building, inspecting it for access. A basement window was broken, a baseball-sized hole in it. It took little pushing to clear it wide enough for his body. He'd once been a fat, healthy groundhog. He discovered he'd become much thinner. In he went, dropping 6 feet to a grungy cement floor. He scuttled on all 4s. It was faster than walking upright on 2 legs, and stopped periodically, listening for guidance. Hey man. Dusty was shocked he had not heard the rat. He gathered himself, stood upright, and said calmly, well, hello to you, mate. The fat charcoal gray rat grinned. You're new here. And big. Be on my side, we'd rule this. Dusty cut the rat off. I'm looking for a human. A girl. Autistic. Not crazy. Pale gray eyes. He was 3 times the rat's size and loomed over him. The rat sensed something about the groundhog. It was written all over its face. The rat's eyes squinted, and it looked at Dusty as if the mammal was a human in disguise. It put a small finger to the corner of its mouth and said, I know whom you are referring to. For a small fee. Quit it. I'll give you, the address of a building that houses a studio where they film commercials. There's a way in. Every day they toss out tons of donuts. The rat's eyes glimmered. It licked its lips. They exchanged information eagerly. Dusty found the girl's room. He huddled in the dark corridor and waited for a nurse to leave. He scooched quickly through the doorway and looked around the gloomy, dismal room. She was sitting up in the bed. She leaned forward and spit the pill from her mouth like he'd seen patients on TV do so many times. She grinned at him and said with her mouth, welcome friend. Dusty was dismayed at how frail and diminished she appeared to be. He came and jumped upon her bed. She squealed softly with glee and giggled, perhaps for the first time in her life, as she hugged him to her. Also, he knew, the first time she'd ever hugged anyone. I knew you'd come. I know you're not real, but I knew you'd come. Sweetheart, I am real. As real as you are. What's your name? Paige clapped her this pale hands together delightedly. Paige. But I prefer Pagan Star. What's yours? Wesley Dustin Humphreys III. But I prefer Dusty. She frowned. Though she was little more than a skeletal waif, she possessed power and great strength. All this Dusty knew. Their eyes spoke volumes. He said, the lighthouse. Yes. My place. It's real, you know. I believe you. You're my first and only friend. You're my savior. She looked around, fully aware of where she was, and shrugged as a tear drifted down her cheek. Dusty said, "I can get us out of here." Paige said, "And I can take you to the lighthouse. You to the lighthouse. You to the light."